Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping straight into a totally fascinating piece of pop culture that actually doubles as a really sophisticated sociological text. When you think of Nas's 1996 hit featuring Lauryn Hill, If I Ruled the World, you probably just think of it as this catchy, feel-good wish fulfillment anthem, right? I mean, fun fact, it was literally the very first hip-hop song to feature a sample of that iconic bass line from Curtis Blow, which is exactly what gives it that incredibly infectious groove. But if you really look closely at the lyrics, it's so much more than just a party track. It's actually a deeply diagnostic policy document. Nas essentially traces a whole web of urban pathologies, things like crime, addiction, family breakdown, right back to their root systemic conditions. And then he imagines what happens when you just completely remove those conditions. So today we're going to break down this legendary track to uncover the macro-level social theory hidden right there in the rhymes.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's how we're going to structure our analysis today. 1. A hip-hop policy document. 2. Street-level utopian flips. 3. Mass emancipation and liberation. 4. Macro visions and black excellence. 5. The harsh return to reality. And 6. The final verdict. Let's get going.
Section 1. A hip-hop policy document. Existential vulnerability. So before that famous beat even drops, Nas starts with these lines. Life, I wonder, will it take me under? I don't know. You have to remember, Nas was only 22 or 23 years old when he recorded this. He's not bragging, he's not boasting, he's setting a tone where mortality, prison, and despair are literally just normalized background noise for young Black and Latino men in 1990s inner cities. In that environment, life itself is an active threat, and understanding this existential vulnerability is absolutely crucial. It's what makes the utopian vision that follows not just some fun daydream, but a necessary escape hatch from a constant, exhausting state of emergency.
Moving right along to Section 2, Street-Level Utopian Flips, the reality check.
Let's look at what Nas is doing here. He says, imagine smoking weed in the street without cops harassing. Imagine going to court with no trial. Now, on the surface, sure, it sounds like a simple desire to just hang out and party in peace. But look at it as a policy stance. This is Nas literally advocating for the end of quality of life policing, the end of stop-and-frisk tactics, and the end of the plea bargain coercion that absolutely dominated that era.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive divide between his vision and his reality. Just look at the contrast. Nas's utopian flip envisions decriminalization for minor offenses and genuine due process. But the systemic reality of the 1990s war on drugs? It functioned like a dark conviction machine targeting very specific communities. It overloaded the courts to the point where over 90% of cases became plea mills, meaning people were often pleading guilty simply to avoid the massive life-ruining risks of going to trial. So Nas is diagnosing a fundamentally broken justice system by imagining its exact opposite.
Let's see how this builds in the next few lines. He raps, lifestyle, cruisin' blue Bahama waters, no welfare supporters, more conscious of the way we raise our daughters. Notice how smoothly he shifts gears here, from policing to the economic and family dimensions of society.
He's painting this vivid picture of Bahamian leisure, but it's deliberately framed as a direct response to generational welfare dependency. He's envisioning true economic dignity. We're talking generational wealth and self-sufficiency, rather than being stuck in these systemic welfare traps that block upward mobility. But what's really fascinating is how he pairs this structural critique with personal accountability. He isn't just asking for money. He demands that men in his community become more conscious of the way we raise our daughters. He's arguing for internal cultural healing, right alongside that external systemic change.
Which brings us to Section 3, Mass Emancipation and Liberation, the hook.
Okay, this is where Lauryn Hill lends those absolutely legendary soaring vocals. If I ruled the world, I'd free all my sons, black diamonds and pearls. This right here is the central demand of the entire track. It's a massive call for mass emancipation. Nas and Lauryn Hill are entirely reframing how society views incarcerated black men. Instead of treating them as societal problems to be managed or just locked away, they're reframed as precious jewels, black diamonds and pearls that are entirely worthy of love and liberation.
Now, what's really interesting here is the tension between literal policy and metaphor. From a literal nuts and bolts governance standpoint, a blanket universal release of all prisoners is, well, an impossibility that compromises public safety. But as a metaphor, it's a profoundly powerful statement. It's a vision meant to aggressively address the vastly disproportionate impact of mass incarceration, which systematically strips fathers, brothers, and sons out of their communities. By imagining this grand mass release, Nas is advocating for reparative justice and the healing of deep generational family trauma caused by the prison industrial complex.
Moving to Section 4, Macro visions and black excellence, institutional shifts.
As we get into the second verse, Nas's vision expands globally, and he starts laying out a series of hardcore institutional demands. First, he wants schools to teach true history instead of the sanitized lies of miseducation. He dreams of releasing political prisoners, activists jailed for their beliefs, and letting them live totally free of state surveillance. He envisions installing truly principled, moral leadership. He specifically names Coretta Scott King to replace corrupt political machines. And honestly, quite strikingly, he imagines a world that heals addiction through abundance and enlightenment, rather than just criminalizing and punishing it.
And that brings us to one of the most provocative and historically loaded lyrics in the whole song. I'd open every cell in Attica, send them to Africa. Now, to really grasp what Nas is proposing here, we absolutely have to understand the essential historical context behind that one word, Attica. So back in 1971, prisoners at the Attica Correctional Facility in New York took over the prison to demand better living conditions and basic political rights. The state's response? A brutal armed assault that resulted in 43 deaths. Almost overnight, Attica became this global symbol of carceral brutality and racial injustice. So when Nas says he'd empty Attica and send everyone to Africa, he's not proposing some literal logistical deportation plan. He's proposing a radical, pan-African alternative to the American penal colony model. He's basically imagining a complete, utter severing of ties with a system so fundamentally broken that the only possible fix is to start over entirely on a completely different continent.
Section 5. The harsh return to reality. Verse 3.
But, a fantasy can really only last so long. As we hit the climax of the song, Nas just drops us completely out of the clouds. He raps, "You love to hear the story how the thugs live in worry, duck down in car seats, heat's mandatory, running from Jake." In just one breath, he abruptly shatters that romanticized Hollywood myth of thug life. He reveals it for exactly what it is, a desperate reality of constant suffocating paranoia. There's nothing glamorous about it. It's living in fear, feeling like carrying a weapon is literally mandatory just to survive, and constantly having to flee from the police, who he refers to here as Jake.
And to explain the mechanics of this paranoia, Nas introduces the concept of the B felony. In 1990s New York, a Class B felony covered severe crimes, things like armed robbery or large-scale drug sales, and they carried massive sentences, up to 25 years. Nas uses this specific legal term to set up his ultimate cause and effect policy analysis regarding crime, punishment, and society.
Let's walk through this, because he breaks it down just like a sociologist. Step 1. Systemic scarcity and blocked mobility prevent any legitimate wealth creation. Step 2. That enforced poverty breeds deep jealousy and forces people into survival-driven hustling. Step 3. That illicit hustling inevitably leads to violent conflicts and, eventually, B felonies. And Step 4. The end result is almost always the same, prison or an early death. So the really crucial point here is that Nas isn't claiming that if he ruled the world, human nature would just change and crime would magically disappear forever. No, he's arguing that in a world of genuine material abundance and safety, the root causes of these specific survival-based crimes would vanish entirely.
And that brings us to Section 6, the final verdict, a systemic diagnosis.
As the song fades out, you're kind of left with this profound realization. We've just listened to a 4-minute pop rap track, but we've somehow absorbed a highly comprehensive systemic diagnosis of modern American life. If we review this, we can see exactly how Nas traces every single urban pathology back to a very specific failure. Economically, he diagnoses poisoned, illicit markets and blocked legitimate wealth. In education, he points directly to chronic underfunding and historical erasure. Within the carceral system, he identifies plea coercion and mass incarceration acting basically as population control. And in policing, he highlights stop-and-frisk harassment and informant tactics that completely destroy community trust. I mean, he literally leaves no stone unturned.
Which leads us to the absolute core thesis of If I Ruled the World. Nas brilliantly argues that crime, trauma, and suffering are not inherent traits of the people living in these communities. They are symptoms of systemic oppression. If you remove the extreme financial strain, if you heal the psychological trauma, and if you dismantle those massive structural barriers, communities are going to naturally flourish into places of peace, joy, and luxury. Peace isn't something you can just enforce with police. Peace is a byproduct of removing the barriers to human flourishing.
Nas used his music to force us to realize just how broken the actual world is by painting an incredibly vivid picture of a healed one. And it leaves us with a challenge that goes so much deeper than a catchy hook. I want you to think about your own community, your own city, and your own institutions. If you ruled the world, what root conditions would you change first? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we keep breaking down the complex ideas that shape our world.